Hi, I'm Melanie Bunn. I'm a nurse consultant with Dementia Alliance of North Carolina, and they've asked me to spend some time talking with you about sleep. Sleep for care partners, sleep for people living with dementia, just sleep. So I want you to take a moment. I want you to think about the last time you had a wonderful night's sleep. The sleep was wonderful. You fell asleep, you stayed asleep, you were comfortable all night long. The perfect temperature, the perfect amount of light, the perfect amount of sound. It was absolutely wonderful. And not only that, when you woke up the next morning, you felt refreshed and you felt excited about the day and energized. And for many of you, that might be a distant memory. And if you're like most of the people I spend time with, you may not even be able to remember specifically the last time you had that kind of sleep. And for people living with dementia, sleep becomes a real challenge as well. So we're going to spend some time talking about what is sleep? Why is it important? What kind of changes are associated with dementia? And then some things to try. And let me go ahead and tell you, there really aren't a lot of if-thens in this situation. So there really aren't many answers that come, if the person doesn't go to bed, then do this and they'll start going to bed. Life is complicated. Human beings are complicated, and people living with dementia are complicated. So we're going to talk about some strategies to try, but if you want some real specific guidance, some real help, problem solving, thinking through what might work for my person, after you give some of these general things a try, reach out to Dementia Alliance of North Carolina and see if they can help you through with some resources or with some direction. So let's go ahead and get started talking about what is sleep. So sleep actually has 4 steps or stages. The first step is that REM sleep, that dream sleep. And we know from research, if you don't get good dream sleep, whether you remember them or not, if you don't get good dream sleep, your brain doesn't work very well. Our brains need that time to really explore and to process. And then you've got 2 other kind of light sleep, moderate sleep, and then that heavy, deep, restful sleep. That when you wake up in the middle of this, if something scary happens and you wake up, you're confused and you don't know where you are, or you don't know what's going on. That's that deep level of sleep. To be healthy, you need all 4 levels of sleep. And it takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to really get through a cycle. And that's why a lot of times you'll notice an hour and a half or 2 hours is kind of how you might wake up through the night, or an hour and a half and 2 hours might be how you might wake up after a nap. To get through all 4 levels, that's what you really need. This is a great place to talk about what doesn't work. And unfortunately, what seems like the easy answer is also the answer that doesn't work. What seems like the easy answer would be medications. And medications aren't the easy answer. We've learned from studying medications that, particularly with older people, they often aren't effective. They did a study with older people without dementia, and they looked at the improvement of sleep and the adverse reactions, kind of those side effects that the medications caused. And for most people, for most issues, they're really not worth it. Because what sleeping medications do is they help people spend time in that second and that third, that light and that moderate level of sleep, which means you're missing the really critically important healing, restful parts, the work parts of sleep, the REM sleep and that deep sleep. And that's not the fault of the medications. That's just how sleep and how brains work. So sleep medications work okay for once in a while. They work okay for crisis. They work okay for special circumstances. But the reality is that's not when we really need it. We can get through 1 night or 2 nights or 3 nights. It's the months of nights where it becomes a real challenge. So let's begin to explore why we need sleep, why it is we can't be healthy without sleep. So even though we think of sleep as just something that makes us feel good, it actually is a time when our brain does a lot of work. Because our brains manage everything, when we're awake and we're alert and we're doing and we're being, Our brain gets caught up in those things and doesn't do a lot of maintenance kinds of work. So during sleep, our brain does a couple of maintenance kinds of things. The first thing it does is really all of that data that's been collected, all of those memories, our brain takes and processes them during sleep. Our brain sorts them and stores them during sleep. That's why some of you can remember studying for a test and feeling really frustrated. I never am going to learn this. I'm going to fail this test. I'm going to do terrible. You go to sleep, you sleep for a few hours, and you wake up and you know more than you did when you went to sleep. That's because your brain did that critical work of processing and sorting and storing while you were giving it the time to do that. The second really important thing that happens while we're sleeping is our brain actually cleans itself. Our brain oxidizes during the work and during the day. That's not a problem. That's normal. You think about it as rust. But we need time to fix that. We need time to process and to clean that. And so during sleep, when other kinds of work aren't happening, our brain takes advantage of that downtime to really get rid of that rust, to really clean that brain, the actual physical inflammation in the brain. So if we don't sleep, we don't store new information and process it, and our brain begins to rust. So everybody can agree that sleep is really important. So we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about some physical things. We're going to talk about some emotional cognitive things. We're going to talk about some environmental things. So let's start with that piece of the physical changes. So when you think about the issues of sleep from a physical perspective, there's really the issues of going to sleep and the issues of staying asleep. And they're quite different. Some people have trouble going to sleep, but once they get to sleep, they're out for a while. Other people wake up through the night. They can go to sleep, but then they wake up through the night. As we go through these different components of sleep, these different pieces of sleep, we're going to talk about some of those kinds of things. So when we think about what helps us sleep, there's a definite relationship between the day and the night. The day and the night. So the things that happen during the day are the things that make a difference at the night. So things like how much activity and how busy you were during the day can make an impact on how well you sleep at night. So think about a day that maybe you were home because you were sick. Not sick enough to be really miserable, but just sick enough to not be around other people. Or think about a day maybe when you were home because the weather was horrible. Maybe there was a hurricane, or maybe there's an ice storm, and you're home during the day. At the end of those days, even though you've been pretty sedentary, you might not feel very restful. You might not feel like resting and sleeping because you haven't really done enough in your day to really earn your sleep, if you will. It's kind of the same thing after a long trip, or the same thing after maybe a conference or a day of classroom, if that's not what you're typically used to. Activity and sleep, day and night. So we start to think about people living with dementia, we begin to think that sometimes their days aren't full enough. Sometimes there really isn't enough in their day. And yes, older people do need more rest. And yes, people with dementia do need rest. But a lot of times, what we provide older people with dementia and people living with dementia in general is not really rest. It's more of an opportunity to wait. And believe you me, there is a big difference between resting and waiting. It makes a big difference. So finding some ways to change that pattern of the day so people have enough activity, enough things to do, so when the nighttime comes, they do feel like their body feels like they've earned that sleep. Their brain feels like they've earned their sleep. So thinking about the ebb and the flow of the day, and we may do another of these on how to manage the day and how to find that ebb and flow of the day. But for here, it's enough just to say to be busy enough, but restful enough, and to alternate that. So people have things to do and times to recover. thinking about things that help turn our brain on or turn our brain off. And blue light and sunlight are things that tend to activate and turn our brain on. So being outside in the daytime, in the morning especially, getting that natural light, that sunlight can really improve sleep of all people, but including people living with dementia. So making that meaningful becomes a real challenge. So maybe I don't want to just sit outside. So maybe what becomes part of my day is we walk to the mailbox. Now, I know as the care partner, I know there's not going to be mail in the mailbox at 8:45 in the morning, but I also know that being out in the sunshine is good for me and for the person living with dementia. So we walk down to the mailbox. The mailman hasn't been, the mail person hasn't been. We walk back in. 15 minutes later, we walk to the mailbox. We've got another 5 minutes of sunshine. We walk back in. So this blue light that's really good in natural ways and sunlight and those kinds of things, full spectrum light in ways that we can really activate our brain, can also become a deterrent to sleep. So we think about things like screens. We're learning more and more that the blue light that's associated with phones, with tablets, with televisions, even with a lot of our lamps and our lights and our even things like our clocks can be really detrimental to sleep. So we want to think about how are we managing those things during the day. Things like caffeine. Now, I have, when you think about drinking problems, caffeine is my drinking problem. I have a coffee problem. So I'm not going to say to anybody, don't have any caffeine, but I am going to say, let's think about how we manage that caffeine and where we get that caffeine from and when we use and get that caffeine. So maybe not having chocolate in the evening, maybe having that chocolate earlier in the day. The last one we're going to talk about in this perspective, getting to sleep, keeping to sleep from a physical perspective, is the issue of bladder function. And I could do a whole nother program on bladder function for people living with dementia, but let's just leave it at a lot of times when people have trouble staying asleep, it's because of the issue of they wake up because it's been a 2-hour cycle. It's time to wake up. They wake up and they feel that fullness in their bladder, so they get up and then they stay up. So we have to think about what can we do to maybe reduce some of that sensation. There's some things that can be really helpful. One thing is not irritating the bladder. The bladder gets irritated by some things and by not others. So the bladder gets irritated by things like caffeine. The bladder gets irritated when there's not enough fluid to process. So one of those strategies we used to use was no fluids after a certain magical moment in the evening. That's not really so good because when the urine gets too concentrated, it irritates the bladder, it becomes a problem. So keeping that fluid, but maybe getting more of them in the morning, less of them towards the evening kind of hours. Because it's absolutely natural and normal for our body to do the work of processing that kind of waste product through the night when it's not busy doing other kinds of work. The last one I'm going to mention is the idea of double voiding. Now, what does that mean? So, when you go to the bathroom, you're getting ready to go to bed at night, almost everybody empties their bladder before they go to bed. I'm going to encourage you to think about doing that twice. And so what that means is I go to the bathroom, I empty my bladder, and then I wash my hands, and then I do the rest of my stuff. So I wash my face, I brush my teeth, I take my contacts out, I do all of the rest of the stuff, and then I empty my bladder again. That double voiding seems to set us up for not needing that to empty as much through the night. So that's some of the physical impact of dementia on sleep. So let's move on to the next component, which is the idea that emotions and thinking have a lot to do with sleep. So many of you can remember, as I can, a night when you settle down to sleep and your brain just activates, it just engages. So I start thinking about the things that went well during the day, the things that didn't go well during the day, things I've got to figure out and problem solve. It's not conducive with sleep. And for people living with dementia, The hours leading up to bedtime can become really complicated. Maybe there are people who come to visit, or maybe the person living with dementia is feeling physically fatigued, or maybe they're feeling pain, because pain a lot of times is more uncomfortable later in the evening than it is earlier in the day. Maybe the care partner is running out of energy and resource, and it's like, I've used up all of today's resources. I'm working on tomorrow, and it's really not looking good for anybody. That doesn't help us rest and relax and sleep. So when we start to think about some of the strategies that might help, thinking about the day as a whole, thinking about reducing things that might trigger strong emotions, positive or negative, things that might trigger activation like visits, thinking about limiting some of those and building into the time that we're transition to bedtime and sleep time, instead of it all of a sudden popping up and now it's time to go to sleep. Thinking about things that can be calming and relaxing, like music. Music and emotions and feelings and mood are connected in a really close way. So when we start to think about how do we use music to meet where we are now and then slowly transition us to a place when we can really relax and get some restful sleep. Prayer, if it works for that person, can be really restful and relaxing and give people a sense of peace that associates with being able to find that moment of being able to sleep. And the last one we're going to talk about is thinking about the routines that we associate with going to sleep. So thinking about things like, for me, for example, it's taking my contacts out. When I take my contacts out, I am done for the day. I don't care if it's the middle of the afternoon because I've got an appointment at the eye doctor, or if it's the first thing in the morning. When I take my contacts out, I am done. That is the trigger. So thinking, what are the triggers for that person to help them get ready to go to sleep? I had a family I was working with, and the challenge that they were dealing with was mom would get settled, she'd be in bed, and they'd hear a noise. And they'd go in, and mom is on the floor. Not, she hasn't fallen, but she's on the floor next to the bed. And this happened over and over and over again. So they wanted to investigate. So what they did one night was get mom settled into sleep and leave a family member in there to kind of observe what was happening. And what they discovered was, after mom got settled, mom got up and knelt by her bed to pray. That was part of her routine. And so the strategy then becomes helping her do that, protecting that routine in a way that is safer for her with someone there, but giving her that opportunity to do that activity that for her specifically triggers a good night's sleep. The last piece we're going to talk about is thing in the environment. We're specifically going to talk about light and noise and temperature. This is very individual. There's research that says people sleep best in a dark, quiet, cool room. That may be what people need to sleep, but that may not be what you need to sleep, or what your person living with dementia needs to sleep. It's what works for you. But generally speaking, reducing particularly blue light from screens, but having a level of light that really is supportive of the person sleeping. Noise that we filter out during the day, we sometimes start to notice at night. So the creaking of the house and the sounds that are outside of the room, we may not notice, but when we settle in to sleep, we begin to notice them at that point. And the room temperature, cool temperatures tend to promote sleep. But for older people, a lot of times because of changes in body composition, their hands and their feet, their lower and their upper extremities, lose some of the fatty pads, so they tend to get cooler faster. So it might mean that the room needs to be cool, but their hands and their feet need to be protected to be able to be warm and not feel cold, so they can settle in and be comfortable. What it comes down to is, if everybody's not having a good night's sleep, nobody's not having a good night's sleep. So to think that I will do this so the person with dementia can sleep, but then I can't sleep, is not the kind of solution that's going to work in this very complicated situation. So try to find some ways that make it work for our home, that make it work for our family, that make it work for our community, that make it work for the person living with dementia. And that might mean needing to be creative. If I am a night nurse, the chances of me sleeping through the night, not very likely. So finding a way to support me in this system is going to make a big difference for everybody to get a good night's sleep. It's complicated. So if you need some help problem solving, figuring out what works for you in your situation with your family, reach out. Reach out to people who know more. Reach out to people who've been through it. Reach out to a support group, or reach out to the people at Dementia Alliance of North Carolina. They've got some good resources they can point you towards, or to help you problem solve what would work specifically in your situation. Have a good sleep.